In this video, I'm going to talk about the feeling of shame, which is actually quite difficult because not all psychologists agree on a formal definition. So, one definition takes more of a biological approach, suggesting that shame involves a dramatic series of physiological changes that coincide with the individual initially feeling neutral or happy or physically excited or engaged, but then suddenly shifting in a way that they feel just awful and paralyzed and physically and socially inhibited. Even a brief overview of this definition is going to sound a bit technical, so just hang in there for a minute. The physiological changes are thought to involve parts of the autonomic nervous system where there is an abrupt inhibition or rapid de-escalation of either the sympathetic branch typically involved in the subjective experience of excitement, interest, or enjoyment, or even a disruption within what's called the ventral vagal complex, thought to be involved in states of relaxation and social engagement. So inhibition of these systems is paralleled by strong activation within parts of the parasympathetic branch, not the rest and digest response that many people learn about in high school textbooks, but instead a second pathway involving what's called the dorsal vagal complex. The terminology isn't overly important, but if you are interested in learning more about this, check out polyvagal theory and the work of Stephen Porges and Alan Shore, particularly with regard to shame. At any rate, the subjective state coinciding with this rough definition of shame is again one of extreme physical discomfort. So some therapy clients describe shame as almost like a nauseating feeling or like an intense pit in their stomach. And of course, the feelings of shame are typically accompanied by certain behavioral cues, including social withdrawal, turning away, or avoidance of eye contact. Now, all this is a grossly oversimplified view of what might be just one take on shame. It's interesting to note, however, that by this rough definition or something close to it, other mammals, for example, dogs, could conceivably experience feeling shame in much the same way that we do. So many dog lovers will probably attest that when they scold their dog, they do indeed look down in a way suggesting that maybe they do feel something on par with what we experience. Now, another definition of shame seems to focus more on the self-conscious or the intentional aspects of shame. It's thought to rely on our capacity to have mental states directed on or toward other objects or even additional thoughts. So by this definition, shame involves a sense of recognizing and experiencing oneself as an object of extreme judgment or criticism in the real or the imagined mind of some other. The person is ashamed, in other words, of what they are as revealed to them in the eyes of this other person. Note that because this definition requires a sustained self-awareness, or a higher order consciousness, other animals would be arguably excluded from experiencing it. In fact, human infants and young children might also be excluded since they have yet to develop an intuitive sense or concept of self, or even some basic capacity to reflect upon their symbolic selves and its inherent value or worth. Okay, so which of these definitions is right? Well, I think both definitions are in some ways correct, but for the sake of clarity, we should be fairly careful about the labels that we use. So I tend to reserve the word shame to involve a combination of these two rough descriptions. So I imagine what non-human animals, infants, and young children to experience to be a kind of proto-shame. It's a primitive component or a precursor to what we might call shame, but it's not quite there yet. So in other words, both definitions are in some ways necessary, but they're insufficient components of what we might refer to as shame. Note that as parents, we evoke this proto-shame response to good effect in our children as a kind of socializing agent. So, for example, when a toddler pulls on the tail of a cat and giggles, it might be followed by a brief scolding from the parent involving a disruption of the child's curiosity, interest, or active engagement. And the neutral or pleasant feeling that they were up until then experiencing is cut off. It's replaced instead by a downcast look from the parent, a stern voice, and perhaps even a timeout, which of course involves being removed from a stimulus-filled environment. And all of this is accompanied again by an unpleasant internal experience. Now, here's the key point. The challenging role of the parent in socializing their child is to ensure that the feelings become associated with the child's behavior and not their developing self-concept. And this is where guilt comes in. So guilt involves feeling bad about what you did, whereas shame involves feeling bad about who you are as a person. Shame is paralyzing and almost unbearable, whereas guilt is unpleasant but not crippling and is often accompanied by empathy for the other person and a desire to repair the relationship or apologize or make amends for your behavior. So guilt is a good thing, and shame is in many ways toxic. I also tend to work from an existential framework. So in my mind, humans are unique in their capacity to self-reflect, to contemplate the meaning of their lives. And one of the most important things for us is to have a sense that we are persons of significance, that we matter in some important way. So whole life is arguably dependent on it. So feelings of shame really threaten to unravel this whole world, which is why experiencing shame is so painful and almost unbearable. And this is why it's so often repressed or often concealed from conscious awareness. So no surprise, of course, that those with shame-prone personalities suffer from debilitating anxiety, signaling the possible threat of experiencing shame, or they'll engage in anger or rage cycles, serving perhaps a defensive function that is, pushing others away so that they can never truly know or experience their true self and open themselves up to this kind of rejection. Okay, so what happens when you have negative self-attributions, but no profound sense of or a visceral feeling of shame? Well, I consider this a kind of almost like an intellectualized shame, or, what we might call a sham shame. And it may have the cognitive components, but it lacks that sort of emotional intensity of the experience of shame in the way that I'm talking about it here. So sometimes it's a matter of just, digging deeper beneath the comments and accessing that feeling. But other times, this sort of response serves a kind of instrumental function and is actually defensive. So, for example, a person who is unfairly fired by their boss, instead of getting angry, they attack themselves and become depressed. I wouldn't consider this kind of self-attack shame in the way that I'm outlining here. Okay, so I hope that this video gives some useful distinctions for thinking about shame and guilt. Before wrapping up, I should also mention that entire books have been written on these topics, so it's a very complex thing to try to understand, and my thoughts, of course, are still developing on this stuff. So if others are interested in carrying on a dialogue, add some comments below, and if you like the video, please make sure that you share it and, of course, subscribe to our channel. Thanks.